Why do countries borrow money? Don't they have any money? It's not that simple. Debt is incurred when a country's expenditures exceed its revenues. It doesn't mean that the country is insolvent and bankrupt. Having debt is a normal practice in the world. How do you know if a country is heavily indebted? Economists usually compare the national debt of a country to its GDP. For example, Switzerland's national debt is only 27%, while Australia's national debt is 151%, with relatively equal amounts of debt. Isn't that funny? This approach enables us to compare the debt obligations of different countries objectively. It doesn't simply show the amount of national debt, which by itself doesn't say anything, but it shows the burden of debt to the country's total production volume and the ability to pay this debt. GDP is a measure of the total size and output of the economy. One measure of the debt burden is its size relative to GDP, called the debt-to-GDP ratio. Mathematically, this is the debt divided by the GDP amount. Generally speaking, there are two types of public debt. Debt held by government accounts or internal, non-marketable treasury securities held in accounts of programs administered by the federal government, such as the Social Security Trust Fund, and debt held by the public or external, obligations to other countries, international organizations, and foreign investors. Domestic public debt is an obligation to citizens and companies of one's own country. Why is this important? Because in the case of the United States, most borrowing is domestic, meaning that most American debt is domestic public debt, roughly 60% of the total amount owed. The US national debt was first recorded on January 1, 1790, at a total of $52 million. Since then, many events have taken place on the North American continent and in the world as a whole, and the American debt has more than doubled. In 1812, the price was fixed at $127 million. In 1861, during the Civil War, the debt approached the $3 billion mark, $2.8 billion to be exact. In 1936, when the Great Depression hit, the national debt was as much as $33 billion. Public debt rose sharply during the 1980s, as Ronald Reagan negotiated with the Congress to cut taxes and increase military spending. It fell during the 1990s because of decreased military spending, increased taxes, and the 1990s boom. Public debt rose sharply during George W. Bush's presidency and in the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, with resulting significant tax revenue declines and spending increases, such as the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008 and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Today, the US debt is only $30 trillion, and it's still growing because of the federal budget deficit. The largest deficit in a decade was under Barack Obama's presidency, with the national debt increasing by as much as 70% during his administration. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government spent trillions in virus aid and economic relief. It caused the number of unemployed persons to increase significantly, which is expected to reduce tax revenues while increasing automatic stabilizer spending for unemployment insurance and nutritional support. As a result of the adverse economic impact, both state and federal budget deficits will dramatically increase, even before considering any new legislation. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the budget deficit for the fiscal year 2020 would increase to $3.3 trillion, or 16% of GDP, more than triple that of 2019 and the largest as percent GDP since 1945. Historically, the largest increase in the US national debt occurred under Franklin Roosevelt, who fought against the Great Depression and the aftermath of World War II. At that time, US debt grew tenfold. In the public mind, the national debt is a symbol of problems or a harbinger of them. Because take the man who has no debt. All is well with them because they know how to manage their money, and those who have them are wasteful and worth staying away from. But in fact, at least with countries, all is different. The debt load on the state doesn't affect the standard of living, you can check it yourself. Just open a table with a list of countries by the size of the state debt. There are special rating agencies in the world that analyze the solvency of different countries and many other indicators, the level of corruption, the state of the economy, etc. They assign credit ratings to countries. The debt ceiling is a legislative mechanism to limit the amount of national debt that can be issued by the Treasury. In effect, it restrains the Treasury from paying for expenditures after the limit has been reached, even if the expenditures have already been approved in the budget and have been appropriated. If this situation were to occur, it is unclear whether Treasury would be able to prioritize debt payments to avoid a default on its debt obligations, but it would have to default on some of its non-debt obligations. Simply put, different countries regulate the amount of their debt in their way. For example, in Germany, it should not exceed 60% of the GDP, although during the coronavirus epidemic, this limit was abolished. The United States also has a ceiling on government debt, but from 1962 to 2011, this limit was raised as many as 74 times. They have raised it even after that, but each time before raising the ceiling, members of Congress argue and discuss the situation, and nothing is done thoughtlessly. It is also important where the government invests the money. Some countries use foreign debt to develop the economy, investing in infrastructure projects and human capital, while others cover current expenses. This approach, of course, will not lead to any development. Can a default happen in America? Commenting on fiscal sustainability, former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke stated in April 2010 that neither experience nor economic theory indicates the threshold at which government debt begins to endanger prosperity and economic stability. But given the significant costs and risks associated with a rapidly rising federal debt, our nation should soon put in place a credible plan for reducing deficits to sustainable levels over time. The US economy is very efficient, but a careful viewer would probably say, okay, the size of the national debt is fine, but it keeps growing and getting bigger. Indeed, in most cases, the size of the national debt of developed countries tends to grow. The first conclusion that comes to mind is that the world economy is getting more and more indebted. But we should not forget that not only the debts are growing, but also their GDP. Economies are just getting bigger and can afford to borrow more, which is perfectly normal. The American government is willing to borrow because it has a good image. America is not just a successful country, it's the world's largest economy, the world's largest market for goods and services, and the largest investor on the planet. The US share of world GDP is over 20%, which is very cool. And all of this makes US government debt attractive both domestically and abroad. In the eyes of investors, it's super liquid and very safe. The US is also the biggest debtor, but it would be strange if the country was, say, 10th in the world in terms of debt. Let me give a simple example. Imagine a billionaire taking a loan. It's unlikely he needs a loan to buy a new iPhone or pay utility bills. Most likely he will need a really large amount of money for his purpose. Government debt in isolation from other indicators does nothing. Compare the national debt of a country to the standard of living of its citizens and look at their life expectancy. Write in your comments, what would you prefer? Live in a country without debt or in a country with a high level of debt? History shows that the national debt is steadily paid and the risk of non-payment is minimized. Yes, sometimes unexpected things happen in the world, who knows? Maybe tomorrow a meteorite will hit the Earth and cause another crash in the American economy. But surprisingly, the current system is stable. But still, are there problems with the payment of the national debt? The answer is obviously yes, but not of the United States. Last year, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt due to a shortage of foreign exchange, and the country stopped paying all of its foreign obligations. The International Monetary Fund has assessed the size of the debt of Sri Lanka as unsustainable. It's not difficult to guess what international investors think about the solvency of the country which refuses to fulfill its obligations. They simply bypass Sri Lanka. And with more or less developed countries in recent years, the problems with the debt were only at Greece. But can it be called the leader of the Western world or the most successful economy in Europe? Hardly. Successful countries hardly ever have any problems with debt. So let's summarize. The national debt is an important indicator, but it doesn't directly affect the average citizen, as long as the government pays its debts and doesn't default. The US, as I said before, pays its debts faithfully. The country has never in its history refused to make payments. Generations of Americans have lived, centuries have passed, and eras have changed, but no matter the hardships, wars or crises, America has paid its debts, unlike any other country. I hope I helped you to understand this topic. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Thank you for watching and goodbye!